far beyond the edge of ordinary maps, beyond the last villages where lanterns still burned and the roads still remembered the weight of travelers' feet. There existed a kingdom shaped by silence and stone, a kingdom where the nights were long, and the sky felt closer to the earth than anywhere else in the world. And in that kingdom there lived a princess who saw the stars differently than anyone before her, not merely as distant lights scattered across darkness, but as living witnesses, ancient eyes watching patiently from above, holding stories older than memory itself. And from the moment she was born, it was said that when she first opened her eyes, she did not cry as other infants did, but instead grew quiet, her gaze lifting instinctively upward as if she recognized something familiar shimmering far beyond the ceiling of the palace chamber. And those present felt a strange stillness settle over the room, as though the night itself had leaned closer to listen. The princess grew in a palace of tall arches and cold marble halls, raised among tapestries depicting heroic battles and ancestral triumphs. Yet she cared little for such images, for her heart was never stirred by swords or crowns or the promise of power, but instead by the vastness beyond the palace walls, by the sky that unfolded each evening like a great unspoken question. And while her tutors spoke of history and duty and the careful balance of alliances, she found herself drifting toward the windows, counting constellations rather than lessons, tracing invisible paths between stars with her fingers as if following roads only she could see. The king, her father, loved her deeply but did not understand her, for he was a man forged by responsibility and fear of loss. And to him the stars were nothing more than cold lights marking the passage of time, reminders that kingdoms rose and fell while the heavens remained indifferent, and he worried that his daughter's fascination with them would pull her away from the solid ground of reality and into dangerous dreams. Her mother, the queen, had once shared the same quiet wonder, though she spoke of it rarely, and on certain nights when the moon was thin and the wind carried the scent of distant forests, she would sit beside her daughter and tell her that the stars were not merely lights, but memories, fragments of stories that had not yet found their endings. And the princess listened as though every word was a gift meant only for her. As the years passed, it became clear that the princess's connection to the stars was not merely poetic, for she began to notice things others could not, subtle changes in the night sky, stars that dimmed or brightened unexpectedly, patterns that shifted just enough to suggest movement, and she felt emotions rise within her that did not belong to her alone. Waves of longing, sorrow, and hope that seemed to drift down from above like invisible rain, and though she could not explain it, she sensed that the stars were speaking in a language made not of sound but of feeling, and that somehow she had been born knowing how to listen. The court physicians dismissed her claims as imagination. The scholars scoffed, and the advisors urged the king to redirect her attention toward more suitable pursuits. But the princess continued to climb the palace towers each night, wrapping herself in cloaks to shield against the cold, standing beneath the open sky until her breath fogged the air and her thoughts felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of the world loosened its grip whenever she looked upward. One night, as the kingdom slept and the torches burned low, she saw a star fall, not in the sudden streak of fire that others described in stories, but slowly, deliberately, drifting downward like a leaf caught in a gentle current. And as she watched, her heart began to race, for she felt unmistakably that this was not an accident of nature, but an answer, a response to something she had been asking without words for her entire life. The falling star vanished beyond the distant mountains, and in that moment the princess knew, with a certainty that frightened and thrilled her all at once, that her life would no longer fit within the walls of the palace, that the stars were calling her not just to watch them, but to follow, and the realization settled into her bones like destiny. From that night on, her dreams changed, filled with endless skies and winding paths of light, with voices that whispered of forgotten promises and a world that had begun to fade because it had been forgotten. And each morning she woke with the sense that time was slipping away, that something precious was waiting just beyond reach, growing weaker with every passing day. She began to wander the palace gardens at dawn, tracing patterns in the dew, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, sensing that the land itself was listening to her in the same way the stars did, and she wondered whether all things were connected by unseen threads, whether the sky and the soil were simply two halves of the same story, separated only by distance and fear. The king noticed the change in her, the growing restlessness, the way her eyes carried both wonder and sorrow. And he tried to speak to her of duty, of the future crown she would one day wear, of the safety the palace provided, but his words felt heavy to her, anchored to a world that no longer felt complete, and though she loved him, she could not promise to remain where her heart could not breathe. The night the stars shifted again, rearranging themselves into a pattern she had never seen before. The princess understood that waiting was no longer an option, that the path ahead, however uncertain, was the only way forward, and as she stood beneath the open sky, feeling the cold stone beneath her hands and the vastness above her, she made a quiet vow, not to her kingdom, not to her crown, but to the stars themselves, that she would seek the truth they were trying to share, no matter how far it carried her from everything she had ever known. She did not leave the palace at once, for destiny rarely demands haste without preparation, and in the days that followed her vow, the princess moved through her familiar world with a heightened awareness, as if every corridor, every face, every sound was quietly saying farewell. And she memorized the way sunlight fell across the stone floors in the morning, the echo of her footsteps in the long halls, the distant laughter of servants who did not know their lives brushed so closely against a story larger than themselves. And at night she returned to the towers, watching the stars as one might watch a beloved friend who is growing faint, learning their rhythms, their silences, their subtle signals, until she began to recognize that the sky itself was a map, not one drawn with lines and borders, but with emotion and memory. And when she followed that map with her heart then her eyes, she could almost feel a direction tugging gently at her, always toward the mountains where the falling star had vanished. It was there, she sensed, that the veil between worlds thinned, where the forgotten and the remembered brushed against one another like passing shadows. And though fear stirred within her, it was not enough to silence the deeper pull, the quiet certainty that she was meant to go where others could not or would not. On the final evening before her departure, the queen found her standing alone beneath the open sky, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. And without speaking, she placed a small pendant into her daughter's hand, an old and simple thing shaped like a star, worn smooth by time, and she told her that long ago, before crowns and walls and rules had hardened the world, people believed the stars were guardians of stories, keeping them safe until someone brave enough came to listen. And the princess understood then that her mother had always known, had always seen the same quiet truth reflected in her eyes. And though tears glistened between them, they did not fall, for this was not a moment for sorrow but for trust. When the princess finally slipped beyond the palace gates under the cover of night, carrying little more than warmth, water, and the pendant at her throat, she did not look back. Not because she did not love what she was leaving behind, but because she knew that to hesitate would be to unravel the courage she had gathered, and the road before her stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the distant glow of stars that seemed to brighten as she took her first steps away from the only home she had ever known. The journey was harder than she had imagined, the land rough and unfamiliar, forests whispering with unseen movement, valleys echoing with loneliness, and yet through every challenge she felt guided, as though the stars themselves bent closer, lending her their light when her strength waned. And there were moments when exhaustion threatened to pull her to the ground, when doubt crept in like a cold wind, asking what right she had to abandon her people, her father, her fate as it had been written for her. But each time she remembered the falling star, the dreams, the ache that had lived inside her long before she had words for it, and she pressed on. As she climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner, the nights colder, and the sky unfolded with a clarity she had never known, stars burning brighter and closer, their light reflecting in her eyes until it felt as though she carried the night within her. And one evening, as she rested on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast expanse of darkness, she felt a presence beside her. Not a figure she could see, but a warmth, a hum of recognition. And without fear she closed her eyes and listened, truly listened, and in that stillness the stars spoke, not in voices but in visions, showing her a world long ago when humans and the heavens were bound together by shared stories, when people looked up not with longing but with understanding, and in those days the stars shone brighter because they were remembered, because their stories were told, their names spoken with reverence. Over time, the stars had begun to fade, not because their light had weakened, But because the world below had forgotten how to see them, had turned inward, building walls and crowns and rules that shut out wonder, and the princess understood then that her gift was not simply to see the stars, but to remember them, to carry their stories back into a world that had lost the language to hear them. When she opened her eyes, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and violet, and she felt changed, steadied by purpose, no longer wandering toward an unknown call but walking a path she now recognized as her own. And as she continued deeper into the mountains toward the place where the falling star had touched the earth, she knew that whatever awaited her there would not be an ending, but a beginning, not just for her, but for a world that had nearly forgotten how to look up. The mountains rose around her like ancient sentinels, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky as if trying to reclaim the stars for themselves, and with every step the princess felt the world grow quieter. Not empty, but attentive, as though the land itself was holding its breath, aware that something long awaited was finally unfolding. And she moved carefully along narrow paths etched by time and weather, her boots scraping against stone, her breath steady despite the thin air, guided always by the subtle pull within. Her chest that grew stronger the closer she came to the place where earth and sky had briefly touched. Nights in the mountains were unlike anything she had known before. The darkness deeper, the stars sharper and more numerous, filling the sky so completely that it felt less like a ceiling and more like an ocean suspended overhead. And as she lay awake beneath them, wrapped in her cloak, she felt their presence not as distant lights but as companions, surrounding her with a quiet reassurance that eased her loneliness and reminded her that she was never truly alone. On the third night among the peaks, she noticed a change in the sky, a faint trembling among the stars directly above her, as though one of them were struggling to hold its place. And she knew instinctively that she was closer than she had ever been to the heart of the mystery that had shaped her life. And when morning came, she followed a narrow ravine that twisted downward into a hidden valley, a place untouched by roads or settlements, where the air shimmered with an otherworldly stillness. At the center of the valley lay a crater, its edges smooth and glassy as though the stone itself had been melted and reshaped. And in its depths rested something that glowed softly even in the daylight, a fragment of light that pulsed like a living heart. And as the princess approached, her pendant grew warm against her skin, responding to the presence before her, confirming what she already knew, that this was the fallen star, not extinguished but waiting. The closer she came, the stronger the emotions that washed over her, waves of longing and sorrow so intense they brought tears to her eyes. And she realized that the star was afraid, not of being broken, but of being forgotten, of fading slowly into nothingness as its story slipped from the world's memory. And without hesitation she knelt beside it, placing her hands near the glowing fragment, careful not to touch it directly. And she spoke, not aloud but with her heart, offering comfort, offering remembrance, offering herself as a bridge between the sky and the earth. In that moment, the valley seemed to vanish, replaced by a vast expanse of light and shadow. And the princess found herself standing within a vision, surrounded by countless stars that pulsed and shimmered with recognition, and they showed her the truth of her role, that she was not meant to return as a ruler bound by tradition, but as a storyteller, a bearer of memory, someone who could remind the world that wonder was not weakness, that looking up was not an escape but a connection. And they asked her, gently but firmly, whether she was willing to carry that responsibility, knowing it would change her life forever. She did not hesitate, for the answer had lived within her since childhood. And as she accepted, the fallen star flared brightly, its light expanding until it enveloped her, filling her with warmth and clarity. And when the light receded, the fragment had vanished, not lost, but returned, its story now woven into her own. The valley grew still once more, the crater empty, but the sky above seemed brighter, richer, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. And the princess stood alone, changed in ways that could not be seen but would be felt by all. She encountered, carrying within her the echoes of countless stories waiting to be told. The journey back was different from the journey out, for though the terrain remained challenging, her steps felt lighter, her purpose clearer, and wherever she rested, the stars seemed to gather above her, watching, waiting, trusting. And when she finally descended from the mountains and returned to the lands she had known, she did not return as a runaway princess, but as something new, something the world had not known it needed. And as she walked toward the distant lights of villages and cities, she began to speak, softly at first, telling stories of the stars, not as unreachable mysteries, but as companions, as keepers of memory. And those who listened felt something stir within them, a forgotten sense of wonder awakening like a long-dormant flame. Children began to look up again. Elders began to remember songs they had not sung in decades. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stars grew brighter, their light strengthening as their stories were shared. And though the princess never claimed a throne, never wore a crown of gold, her influence spread farther than any kingdom's borders, carried on words and dreams and quiet moments beneath the night sky. And in time, her name became less important than what she represented. The reminder that the world was larger, kinder, and more connected than it appeared, and that sometimes the most powerful journeys were not those that claimed land or titles, but those that taught people how to look up again and remember that they were part of a story written not just on the earth beneath their feet, but in the endless, watchful stars above. As the princess traveled onward, moving from village to village and from quiet roads into crowded market towns, she learned that stories, once spoken, have a life of their own. And though she never announced who she was or where she came from, people sensed something different in her presence, a calm depth in her voice, a warmth in her gaze, as if she carried with her a piece of the night sky itself. And when she spoke beneath open stars, listeners felt time slow, worries loosen, and memories surface that they had not realized were still within them, memories of lying in fields as children, tracing shapes in the darkness, believing the universe was listening back. She spoke of stars as travelers like themselves, moving through vast distances, carrying light born long ago, arriving only when someone was ready to receive it. And the people listened not because the stories were grand or dramatic, but because they felt true, resonating with something quiet and forgotten in their hearts. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began to look upward again, not seeking answers but connection. In some places, elders recognized fragments of her tales, recalling half-forgotten myths passed down through generations. And they added their own words, their own memories, weaving new threads into the growing tapestry, and the princes welcomed these additions, understanding that stories were not meant to remain unchanged, but to grow, to breathe, to reflect the voices of those who carried them forward. At night, when she rested alone, she felt the stars respond, their light steady and strong. And though she could not see them move, she sensed their quiet gratitude, their renewed presence in a world that had begun to remember them once more. News of the wandering storyteller spread, not as rumor or legend, but as a feeling. A shared experience whispered from one person to another, and though some dismissed it as coincidence or fancy, others traveled great distances simply to sit beneath the sky and listen, and each time something subtle shifted, a brightness returned, a sense of belonging rekindled. Far away in the palace she had left behind, the king stood one night at his own window, gazing upward as he had not done in years. And for reasons he could not explain, he felt less alone, less burdened by the weight of the crown, and though he did not know where his daughter was, he sensed that she was doing exactly what she had been meant to do. And in that quiet acceptance, the stars above the kingdom shone just a little brighter. The princess continued her journey without seeking an end, for she had learned that purpose was not a destination but a motion, a continual act of listening and sharing. And as seasons changed and years passed, her hair streaked with silver knot. From age alone, but from nights spent beneath endless skies, she remained a bridge between worlds, reminding people that wonder was not something to outgrow, but something to return to again and again. And so the story of the princess who saw the stars became less about her and more about those who listened, those who remembered, those who learned to lift their eyes and find comfort in the vastness above. And though time moved on and names faded, the stars endured, shining with renewed clarity, carrying within their light the echoes of countless voices. And somewhere beneath that same sky, a traveler would pause, look up, and feel a quiet pull in their heart, the beginning of a story waiting to be told, just as hers once had been, written not in crowns or walls, but in starlight, memory, and the enduring bond between the sky and the souls who dared to see it.